This is another short one, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Hello everybody, welcome back to Meddling in Antiquity. My name is Teray, and today we're going to be talking about the Netflix original anthology series, Love, Death, and Robots. Getting into a general overview of what the show actually is. So, Love, Death, and Robots is an anthology series, but it's a little different than kind of a typical anthology series that Netflix has produced before, given that this one is primarily animated. There's only one episode that is really live action, and it's only partially so. It's 18 episodes. Each episode is a different length, a different animation style, and a different story, and they are all science fiction, fantasy, and horror based. It's a really cool show. As soon as it dropped on Netflix, I started watching it, and I binge watched all the way through it like lightning. It's a really cool show, and it's very, very interesting to watch. It's interesting to see like the difference in the stories and these really incredible ideas that people come up with and that they came up with for this particular anthology series. So the breakdown of how I'm going to do this is I'm going to go through all 18 episodes, kind of giving a brief summary of the story, of the plot of each episode, and I'm also going to be kind of highlighting my favorite episodes, because I do have quite a few favorites in this series, but I don't think there's really a miss in any of the episodes at all. So now that I've given you just a general idea of the plot, let's get into it. Episode 1 of Love, Death, and Robots is called Sunny's Edge, and it is a science fiction horror story where characters are essentially in an underground fighting ring where they put their consciousness into these different monsters, and those monsters fight each other for whatever the pot is at the end. It's a really good episode. It's one of my favorites. It's what starts the series off, and it starts it off incredibly. It's got Lady Smooching in it. It's fantastic. It's a really incredible story, and I really like the twist ending, because there is a twist ending to this one, and I really, really liked that they started it off so explosively. Episode 2 is called 3 Robots. It's really fun. It's not one of my favorites, but it's a really fun story about 3 robots wandering through this post-apocalyptic world, and essentially kind of trying to find their way to a certain place. It's essentially 3 robots viewing the world after an apocalypse as kind of a tourist destination. They're tourists wandering through this post-apocalyptic world. It's a really funny episode. It's very fun. Episode 3 is called The Witness, and that is probably the most iconic and most well-known episode from the entire first volume of this particular one, and that is also one of my favorites. And it is a cyclical story about a woman who witnesses a murder, and she essentially is on the run from this killer. And the interesting thing about the story is that the end reveals that the whole thing is a cycle. It's really, really cool episode, and the visuals of it are absolutely phenomenal. It's such a cool episode to watch, and I really love rewatching it, because it's just so cool to see that story consistently play out over and over and over again. It's really incredible. Episode 4 is Suits, and that is about a colony of farmers on another planet who are essentially in mech suits fighting off an alien invasion. That one is a really fun one. Not one of my favorites, but it's a really cool one, and it really does kind of play up the sci-fi element, and there is a really cool ending to it that is a bit sad, but also really, really incredible. Episode 5 is called Sucker of Souls. This is one of my favorites. And this is kind of a more traditionally animated. Pretty much all the other ones are 3D animated. This one and episode 8 are traditional 2D animation, and I really appreciate that, because that is something that has kind of fallen out of kind of animation in general, and I think it's really unfortunate because 2D animation, when done well, can be absolutely incredible. Studio Ghibli, for example. But Sucker of Souls is kind of like playing on this Dracula myth. It almost kind of feels like a dungeon crawler because it does have those elements to it. And this one is one of my favorites. It has the feel of kind of like Dracula meets Pathfinder. It's very much kind of feels like a role play like thing. It feels very role play. It feels like towards the end of the episode I was like waiting for somebody to say roll initiative. It has that kind of feel to it, and I really appreciate that because I love it when that's something that is included in animation or anything, really, is that element of it feeling like a game. I really enjoyed that episode. Episode 6, When the Yogurt Took Over, is the shortest episode in the anthology, and that is about a microculture that develops in yogurt, and it becomes hyper intelligent and takes over human society. And that is actually narrated by a very familiar voice that people will know, and it is the same voice actor who played Kif in Futurama. It's very recognizable right from the start. You know exactly that is the person narrating it. That is a very fun one. It's the tamest story. It's the tamest one in the entire anthology so far. It's fun. It's the only one that's safe for children to watch. Well, not the only one, but it's the only one that I would consider a child watching, and that's it. Then there's Beyond the Aquila Rift, which messed me up so bad that I have only ever watched it once. I cannot bring myself to watch it again because this one really plays into the science fiction horror element of it, and it is very similar to the cyclical element we see in The Witness, where it is this character who is kind of stuck in this place and is having to relive this particular segment of time over and over and over again. And that's really all I can say without giving away the twist at the end. But that one is a very scary one. If science fiction horror is your thing, that is going to be a really good one for you to watch. Episode 8, Good Hunting, is probably if I had to pick a favorite of all of mine in the entire 18 episodes, Good Hunting is 100% hands down my favorite. And that is the traditional 2D animated one. And it takes place in this really gorgeous, like, steampunk feudal Japan, and is about a young man whose father is a monster hunter, and he makes friends with a monster. It's a really good episode, and it's a really emotional episode. But the mix of mythology and the use of steampunk and showing punk in film, especially punk as it is there in steampunk in feudal Japan, is something that we don't see often. And I thought that was such a really cool way to kind of incorporate the mythology and that technology of steampunk into that story. And it's so well done. And I think if you're a fan of anime, if you're a fan of traditional animation, and if you're a fan of just general like steampunk or punk in literature or media, that is going to be a really good episode for you to watch. Episode 9 is The Dump, and that one's kind of a more funny one. It's about this old man who lives in a garbage dump that people are trying to get him to sell off. He owns the dump and people are trying to get him to sell off, but he refuses, and there is a very particular reason for that. I can't give it away because it would spoil the story, because like I said, these are shorts, so there's really not much I can tell you about them without spoiling everything. But that is a fun one. It's not a favorite, but it's a very fun one. Episode 10 is called Shapeshifters, and that is also kind of mixing mythology with the modern world, and that is about shape-shifting werewolves in the US military fighting in the Middle East. So that one's a really interesting one. Not a favorite, but it's very interesting. Helping Hand is one that also really messed me up, and that is kind of like the worst case scenario of like anybody who's in space on their own. It's about a young astronaut woman who gets whose cord to her ship gets disconnected, so she has to find a way to keep herself from floating off into open space and get herself back to her ship so she can get back inside. And that one is really difficult to watch, actually. It's really difficult to stomach that one. Fish Night, episode 12, is about two kind of door-to-door salesmen who have to stop for the night, and they see this really weird phenomenon in the middle of the, I believe it's in Arizona, just in the plains of Arizona, and they see these mirages of these different fish. It's like underwater in the sky, and they can go in and they can interact with it. It's really cool, and it ends really messed up, but it's a very good episode. Episode 13, Lucky 13, which is one of my favorite episodes, is about a young woman voiced by Samira Wiley and her ship, Lucky 13, in the military, and the journey that the ship goes through. And it's kind of very similar to, it bounces back and forth between her point of view and almost the ship's point of view, which I thought was really cool. It is a very, very, very good episode, and I really recommend that one. Zima Blue, which is probably my second favorite episode in the entire anthology, episode 14, is about I guess you call him an automaton, essentially, who built himself up from a very specific thing and became an artist known for making these massive, literally massive, going into beyond the atmosphere, going into space murals of this very specific color called Zima Blue, which is where he takes his name from. And there's a very touching story about that particular shade of blue that he uses in all his art. And that episode is really, the reason I like that and the reason I like Good Hunting are on the same level, because they're both very emotional, they're both very meaningful, and both have very personal feeling stories behind them. And I thought that was really cool. Blind Spot is a really interesting one, and that is about a group of robots who are on they're essentially, it's like the robot version of Mission Impossible. They're on a heist, and they have a very specific goal, and they have to achieve that goal, and it's kind of focusing on this new member who's kind of trying to help them get to that goal. That one's a very fun one. Ice Age is the only live action based film in the entire thing, and that is about a couple who move into a house that has like one of those old style refrigerators, and in the freezer portion there is essentially a society that builds, and it's essentially going from the Ice Age and back again, so a full rise and fall of civilization. They get to watch it happen in this freezer. It's really interesting, and the mix of live action and this kind of really cool, very specific focused animation I thought was a really interesting way to do it. Alternate Histories is probably the most entertaining episode for me. It is kind of my last favorite in this, episode 17, and that is it's kind of based on like a server, like an app or something, where you can go in and you can input an alternate history scenario, and the one they use is what if Hitler had died before becoming the Vice Chancellor of Germany. And it is a very fun episode to watch. It's really entertaining, and it's just, the scenarios become, as you get further into the episode, just increasingly ridiculous, and it's really fun to watch. It's really funny to see how someone can come up with all these different scenarios, and it's a really fun episode. It's a very entertaining and imaginative way to do something like that, a speculative piece like that. I thought it was really cool. And then the final episode of the first volume, episode 18, The Secret War, is about a group of Russian soldiers who are essentially fighting like Nightcrawler type monsters. That one is very interesting, and that one really plays up on the horror suspense vibes that the series has, because it's a very interesting anthology, but all of them tend to be within sci-fi, fantasy, or horror. But The Secret War takes place kind of, I'm thinking by the clothing that they're wearing, it would be either late 40s, early to mid 50s. but it's kind of a war that the Russians are fighting against these mythological creatures that are not supposed to exist but do, and they have to fight those on top of everything else that they're dealing with. And that was a really cool way to kind of round out the story, and it ends in kind of like a melancholy way, but it's an interesting episode. Like kind of in like that mixing fantasy with real life with history idea. It's a really interesting episode in regards to that. So now that I've given you just kind of summary of all of the episodes, hopefully piqued your interest about a few of them and about the anthology series itself, let's get into final thoughts. I really enjoyed my first watch through of Love, Death, and Robots. It's a really cool idea, and I think it's a concept that was not just cool to watch, but was also really well done. All of the stories, regardless of whether or not they kind of mixed genres, they all kind of had the pacing of the series essentially was very well thought out. The placement of each episode from beginning to end was very, very well thought. And I really appreciated the fact that they found a way to pace the series in a way that there's not all the horror stuff clumped together, all the explicitly like science fiction stuff clumped together, and then all the more lighthearted fantasy stuff clumped together. They spaced it out and they spread it out, and they made it interesting to watch because you got this different flavor with each individual story. And the mixed mediums of each one really kept me engaged through watching the show, and that is something I really deeply appreciated about it, because if sometimes with anthologies there are things that are misses and it's really hard to stay in it if you have an episode that's like right in the middle where you're like, oh, well, I don't want to watch this, but because there's a lot of horror and there tends to be a lot of bloodshed in this particular series, they do give you those moments where there are mental breaks. So if you need to just not have all of the stuff that's in your face, you can pretty much always count on there being an episode that is not gory or something that is more meaningful and more lighthearted that comes after the really kind of gory, hardcore stuff. And it's really important to pace it like that, because people need mental breaks when they're dealing with subject matter like a lot of the things that they're dealing with in the show. So it has been confirmed that there is going to be a volume 2 at some point. I am not sure when that is going to be. There has been no news about it since they announced that there would be a second volume. I am very anxious to see the second volume because I would love to see what these creators, if they bring back the same people or if they bring in new people, are going to come up with and what we're going to see in that second volume. So this has been Serial Scrutiny. Barring any incredibly life-shattering, horrifying discoveries made in the next day or several days or so, because I am filming this on a Thursday, you will be getting it on a Saturday. I will see everybody on Sunday for Sociopolitical Smackdown. Bye.